The Columbian discovery of the Americas was one of the most important and revolutionary events in the history of humanity. On a single day, October 12, 1492, the size of the world doubled, and Christopher Columbus, the leader of this expedition, went down in history both famous and infamous as the man who discovered America. This historic event should be recognized as the catalyst which saw our world changed forever, for better or for worse. That being said, it may not have been the true first time humans from the Old World sailed across the ocean, and it's actually well known that Columbus wasn't the first European to reach the Americas at all. The Vikings had already colonized Iceland and Greenland roughly a millennium ago by the year 950 CE. By 999 CE, Leif Erikson is known to have left Norway on his way to convert Greenland to Christianity, and was blown off course, and as a result found a new landmass, which he eventually came back to explore, making it as far down as New Brunswick in Canada. The settlements he built here were only temporary, and after trade with the natives turned up unsuccessful, Erikson returned to Greenland unaware of the scope of his discovery. Evidence for this voyage include the ruins of Viking settlements at the L'Anse aux Meadows, as well as historical accounts of the journey. This, by most definitions, is the only definitively proven contact between the Old and the New World prior to the voyage of Columbus. But that doesn't mean there isn't some evidence that points towards earlier discovery events. Sticking with European exploration, there are some that believe the Romans could have made it to the Americas thousands of years ago. As it stands currently, we have evidence that the Romans made it as far as the Canary Islands off the coast of Africa, which are still over 4,000 kilometers away from the nearest portion of mainland America. Most potential evidence that Romans made this nearly 4,000-kilometer voyage comes from objects found throughout the New World which resemble the craftsmanship of the Romans more than any other Native American style. Perhaps the most popular example is the Tkaksik Kalixtihuaka head, or however you say it, I can't pretend I actually know. The artifact in question was discovered in a burial offering dated from between 1476 before Columbus and 1510 after Columbus. The terracotta head shows what many consider to be particularly European features and doesn't match any known native art styles. After analysis by several art historians and archaeological experts, it was concluded that the figure was at least compatible with Roman sculpture styles from around the 2nd century. That being said, many have called into question the artifact's authenticity, or have even suggested it found its way here after Columbus arrived. Another popularly cited example of out-of-place artifacts was found in Guanara Bay in modern-day Brazil. Beneath the waters here, remains of a shipwreck were uncovered in the late 1970s and continued to be found into the 2000s. Found among the shipwreck were the littering of many ceramic jars. After being analyzed by experts, these jars were identified as likely being amphorae, a container type used commonly by Greeks and Romans. These amphorae were so regular, in fact, that it was common practice for a trading ship to just dump them in the water near where they anchored because it was easier and faster to sail without them weighing down a vessel once they had been emptied. Fragments from an estimated 200 amphorae were found under the waters of this bay in Brazil, and some have used this to suggest that Romans were trading with the natives of this region. Other explanations have been given, however, including a merchant ship being blown off course on its way to the Canary Islands, or even the wreckage of a ship being deposited here by ocean currents. While there are plenty of other theories involving the ancient Europeans and especially the Romans, the next ones I want to talk about comes from the Irish. To understand this one, first we need to learn about an old Irish writing system called Ogham. This language began to develop around 500 CE and made use of many lines carved into a pillar to represent different letters. This is still considered one of the most unique writing systems ever devised by humans and is unlike any other writing system ever studied. So, when rock carvings like these, dated between 500 and 700 CE, were found in locations throughout Virginia and West Virginia in North America, it made many people question if there could have been some kind of Irish influence almost 5,000 kilometers away from Ireland. But for the most part, these claims are largely unsupported in the scientific community, although no other idea is popularly supported either. The interesting part of this, however, well actually this is all interesting, but the really interesting part, I guess, is that the Irish have a completely separate story that's been passed down through the generations, which some believe is connected to this story. The tale involves Saint Brendan, an Irish monk said to have sailed across the Atlantic to discover paradise. Roughly around the same time these markings were estimated to have been made. The story is pretty long, but in short, St. Brendan leaves Ireland with 14 other monks to discover new lands called the Isle of the Blessed. While on this journey, Brendan and the 14 monks and a couple of latecomers encounter some strange animals, some familiar ones too. They run into a few people, some described as having darker skin complexion, and they generally get into shenanigans until Brendan and the rest of his posse decide to head back home. On the way, it's said that they passed an island of blacksmiths who tossed molten slag out at their ship, and then they passed by crystal pillars. The island of blacksmiths is thought to be an interpretation of the volcanic island of Iceland, spewing out molten rocks as they sailed by, while the crystal pillars is thought to be an allusion to floating icebergs found throughout the North Atlantic. To add a cherry on top of all of this, in 1977, the British explorer Tim Severin completed a voyage from Ireland to America using only a traditional Irish kirk boat, proving that at the very least this trip, and therefore this story, was possible. Of course, lines marked on a cave and an old Irish imrim aren't exactly hard evidence, and if none of these seem very possible still, then we're going to need to leave Europe. In fact, ideas about Africans reaching the Americas before Columbus are equally numerous and might even be more convincing. Before I get to them though, I just want to look at the geography of this a bit, hope you don't mind. Because when you take a real look at things, Africa and South America aren't actually terribly far apart from one another. The closest tips of each continent are less than 3,000 kilometers away, but off the coast of Africa are also the Cape Verde Islands that make a suitable restocking station. If launched from here, the trip to South America would be less than 2,600 kilometers. Not to mention, if you look at prevailing wind patterns over this part of the world, we can see that winds around the equatorial Atlantic all blow from Africa to South America. These are what's called the northeast trade winds. Trade winds because they're the same winds that were later used by Europeans during the times of the Columbian Exchange and colonization. What this means is that sailing across this sizable gap could be fast and efficient if explorers had a good understanding of the winds in the area. So it's no surprise that talk of Africans reaching America before Europeans started as far back as 1862, when the first colossal head of the ancient Mesoamerican Olmec civilization was discovered in modern-day Mexico. When analyzing the facial features displayed on these heads, it was noted how similar they looked not to the native people but to Africans, and it was suggested that the heads were either created with Africans in mind or by Africans themselves who had traveled here. Now, these ideas have been heavily rejected by much of the scholarly community, but it has left the question of African activity in America open, and since then other theories have emerged. It's commonly believed that Native American populations came across the now underwater land bridge of Beringia, which once connected Alaska to Siberia. And this has been more or less confirmed by genetic analysis, showing Native Americans' closest relatives to be those genetic groups from Eastern Asia. But what's strange is that many of the oldest human remains uncovered in the Americas come not from the land around Beringia, but rather further south, towards the middle of the landmass. The most well-known example of this are the remains of a teenage girl, nicknamed Naya, found in the Yucatan Peninsula in modern-day Mexico, nowhere near where humans supposedly first stepped foot on the continent. The bones left by this unfortunate girl and those of other early inhabitants of America were found to have completely different bone structures from the Native Americans later found by Columbus. Instead, their faces were smaller and shorter, while their entire skulls were longer and narrower than the typical Native American. Reconstructions of the girl's face revealed these differences much clearer, for me anyway, and show just how these features are much more in line with those of a person of African descent, as well as possibly Native Australian or Pacific Islander. This isn't the only fossil like this discovered in America either, and the finding of similar ones, all older than the ones found in Beringia, has called into question whether those Asian explorers who crossed Beringia really were the first people to walk on American soil, or if its first inhabitants were of African or even possibly Pacific descent. The last thing I want to talk about in relation to Africans making their way to the Americas actually has to do with Columbus himself, and more specifically his third voyage to the Americas. It was recorded by the historian Bartolomé de las Casas that Columbus's sole purpose on this voyage was to test the claims that had made it all the way to King John II of Portugal. These claims described how canoes had been found which set out from the coast of Guinea, which is West Africa, and sailed to the west with merchandise. Or basically, people from West Africa were sailing out west into the Atlantic with valuable things for trade, and King John of Portugal was curious about where these goods were going. Following these directions, Columbus sailed for the west of Africa and discovered the continent of South America. Whether or not these myths of African merchants were true, the land they were supposedly traveling to was real, which, if you ask me, gives at least some credence to these stories. Despite this, there's still been no tangible evidence to back up these claims other than word of mouth from some long dead and lost original sources. Moving away from Africa and the Atlantic Ocean as a whole, we come to East Asia and the Polynesian Pacific. Now, if we again look at the prevailing wind patterns that may have helped Africans reach the east coast of the Americas, the opposite is true in the Pacific, where winds blowing east to west would have impeded explorers' ability to travel east near the equator. But the opposite is true at higher latitudes, where prevailing winds could have helped push explorers towards the Americas. These are collectively known as the westerlies, which blow from the west to the east. These wind patterns result in ocean currents in the Pacific that look pretty similar, forming an ocean gyre which moves water from around Japan all the way to the American west coast. Before we get talking about ancient East Asians traveling to the Americas, I want to give a brief summary of the story of the three Kichis. You see, while serving as crew members on a rice transport ship, 3 Japanese men, Iwakichi, the ship's navigator, Kyukichi, an assistant cook, and Odokichi, another assistant cook actually, and 11 other men encountered a storm in the western Pacific, off the coast of Japan. During the storm, the mast and rudder broke off from the ship, leaving it and its crew stranded in the middle of the Pacific. But because it was a rice transport ship, the men actually had enough food to survive, and over 14 months, the Pacific Ocean Current, now called the Kuroshio Current, took the boat and the surviving crew across the ocean and deposited them in Washington state. By the time they arrived on land, only the 3 Kichis remained, everyone else having died from nutrient deficiencies. There's a lot more to this story too, but for our purposes, this is the first recorded example of a boat being swept from Japan to North America entirely without a source of propulsion or steering. Events like this have been recorded several times afterwards as well, and many scholars find it hard to believe that these events only started to occur after the Columbian discovery. I guess I should stress again that we don't actually have any evidence of this happening prior to colonization of the continent, and all statements about this are entirely circumstantial. If we take another look at the prevailing winds and currents in the Pacific though, we can see the Kuroshio Current is mirrored in the southern hemisphere by the South Pacific Current, which opens up the possibility of an American discovery by the Polynesians as well. Now, it's already well known that the Polynesians were master seafarers and navigators, which might explain why there's possibly the most evidence in favor of contact between the Polynesians and Native Americans. There are numerous examples of this, but my favorite includes the sweet potato, which is known to have originated in Central and South America. But when exploring the Pacific, early Europeans also found them growing throughout Polynesia. Now, most of the islands the Polynesians inhabited were volcanic in origin, meaning they never shared any sort of geological history with America, and therefore the sweet potato must have been brought here by some other means. Some have used this to say that the Polynesians themselves arrived in South America and brought vine clippings back with them to farm, while others have proposed that the vegetable managed to disperse itself by riding ocean currents over many thousands of years. This theory of a Polynesian introduction, however, would help explain too why the Proto-Polynesian word for sweet potato, kumala, is noted to be very similar to those of South American Quechua and Aymara words for the same crop, komar and komara. I should remind you, there are also numerous other similar examples to this one, which include everything from Peruvian mummies being found with sap from a New Guinean tree, all the way to canoes in California resembling both in form and name those built by the Polynesians. Like I said at the beginning though, none of these hypotheses have been proven with large amounts of undisputed evidence. Obviously, someone made it to America before Columbus, as evidenced by all the millions of people in ancient civilizations found here upon first contact. Clearly, these people were the true discoverers of America, as they were the first to establish permanent settlements on the continent, thousands of years before Columbus or Leif Erikson or anyone else. Discovered is a relative term in this video, as I hope you realized instead of writing redundant comments down below. I'm not saying any of these have been legitimized to the point that we need to change our history textbooks. All I'm trying to say is that there are things in this world that should make us question our understanding of American discovery and exploration, and world history as a whole. Regardless of what the answer is, the question who discovered America is still a question I believe is worth asking, and can only help to improve our understanding of history that has long since passed. I hope you agree with me on this one, and judging by the fact that you watched this entire video, I'd say you would. Besides that, let me know of any other questionable examples of people making it to the Americas before Columbus. I find this topic very interesting. If you want to keep seeing videos like this, I'd suggest checking out my Patreon. That's how all these people got their name on here, and that's how I keep this channel running. I should be back next week with another video, so subscribe if you want to see that. Thanks!